High in the spine of the American West, above the tree line where the air turns thin and the wind never really stops, there are streets that nobody walks anymore. Doors hang open on empty saloons. Rusted stove pipes lean against collapsed roofs. In some places, dinner plates still sit on the tables inside abandoned homes, as if the people who once lived there simply stood up one morning and walked out into the snow, never intending to come back, and never did. These are the lost towns of the American gold rush, and their story is not just about gold. It is about hope taken to its outer edge, about the terrifying speed with which fortune can rise and vanish, and about a generation of men and women who built entire civilizations out of nothing, in some of the most unforgiving terrain on the continent, only to watch the mountains reclaim everything within a single human lifetime. To understand how a town could appear and disappear so quickly, you have to understand what gold does to people. In the middle of the 19th century, the discovery of gold in California ignited something that had never quite existed before in American life, an overnight, continent-spanning fever that pulled people from farms in Ohio, docks in Boston, rice paddies in southern China, and mining villages in Wales and Cornwall, all converging on remote mountain ranges most of them had never heard of a year earlier. The first great strike came in 1848, at a sawmill on the American River in California, when a carpenter named James Marshall noticed flecks of metal catching the morning light in the water. Within 18 months, California's population had exploded from under 20,000 non-native residents to well over 100,000. But California was only the beginning. As the easy surface gold along the rivers thinned out, prospectors did what prospectors always do: they pushed further, higher, and deeper into the wilderness, chasing rumors of veins running through granite in places where snow could fall in July and the nearest doctor might be 100 miles and a mountain pass away. This is where our story truly begins, in the high basins of the Sierra Nevada and the Rocky Mountains, where a handful of these mining camps did not just survive, they thrived, for a while, with a strange and feverish intensity that still startles historians today. Picture a narrow canyon in eastern California, nearly 9,000 feet above sea level, boxed in by jagged, treeless peaks that hold snow well into June. In 1859, prospectors working their way through this unforgiving country stumbled onto a promising outcrop of gold-bearing quartz. Word spread the way it always did in that era, through saloons, through letters home, through newspapers hungry for any story that promised riches. Within a few short years, a town rose out of that canyon floor that would come to be called Bodie, named, according to local legend, after a prospector named Waterman S. Bodie, who had died in a blizzard nearby years before the town bearing a version of his name ever existed. By the late 1870s, when a major vein was struck at the Standard Mine, Bodie exploded into one of the wildest, most notorious boomtowns in the American West. At its peak, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 people called it home. It had banks and breweries, a Wells Fargo office, a Chinatown with its own temple, dozens of saloons stretching along Main Street, and by most contemporary accounts, one of the highest rates of violence of any town in California. Newspapers as far away as the East Coast printed stories about Bodie's gunfights and its almost daily funerals, and a well-known, possibly apocryphal, line was said to have been written by a young girl whose family was relocating there: "Goodbye, God, we are going to Bodie," a phrase that stuck to the town's reputation for the rest of its existence. But Bodie's winters were brutal even by the standards of the High Sierra. Temperatures could plunge to 20 and 30 degrees below zero. Blizzards could bury the town for days. Wood had to be hauled in from miles away because the surrounding slopes had been stripped bare almost immediately to feed the stamp mills and heat the homes. And as the richest ore bodies played out through the 1880s and into the 1890s, the population began to drain away just as quickly as it had arrived. Miners chased new strikes elsewhere. Businesses closed their doors. By the early 20th century, Bodie had shrunk to a scattering of a few hundred hardy residents, and a series of devastating fires, one in 1892 and a final, decisive one in 1932 that tore through most of the remaining business district, finished what economic decline had started. By the 1940s, Bodie was essentially empty, its buildings left standing exactly as their owners had abandoned them, frozen in what historians and park rangers now call a state of arrested decay. Today, the town survives as a California State Historic Park, deliberately preserved rather than restored, so that visitors can walk down the same dirt streets and look through the same dusty windows that the last residents saw before they finally gave up on the mountain. Bodie's story, dramatic as it is, was not unique. It was, in many ways, the template. Across the mountain west, this same cycle repeated itself again and again throughout the second half of the 19th century, with slight regional variations depending on the ore, the terrain, and the transportation available to reach the outside world. Travel now across the Sierra and into the heart of the Rocky Mountains, into the high country of central Colorado, where a different kind of gold town grew up in the shadow of some of the tallest peaks in the continental United States. In the early 1880s, prospectors working the upper reaches of Chalk Creek, deep in the Sawatch Range near modern-day Buena Vista, discovered promising deposits of gold and silver in the rock. The town that rose there took the name St. Elmo, and for a brief window it became one of the liveliest settlements in the district, home to roughly 2,000 residents at its height, along with dance halls, hotels, a telegraph office, and a general store that, remarkably, would go on to outlast almost everything else in town. St. Elmo sat at over 10,000 feet, tucked into a valley so steep and narrow that sunlight only reached certain streets for a few hours each day. The Denver, South Park and Pacific Railroad eventually extended a line up the canyon to serve the town, an engineering achievement in itself, given the grades and the harsh winters the crews had to work through. For a decade or more, St. Elmo buzzed with the sound of stamp mills crushing or around the clock, the shouts of freight teamsters, and the particular rhythm of a mining town's daily life, miners heading up the mountain before dawn, merchants opening their shutters, and, in the evenings, the glow of lamplight spilling out of saloon windows onto the packed dirt of Main Street. Then, as with so many of these towns, the ore began to run thin, and the railroad that had once been the town's lifeline eventually stopped running altogether, its tracks pulled up for salvage in the 1920s once traffic no longer justified the expense of maintaining a route through such difficult terrain. Without the trains, St. Elmo's isolation became almost total. Families who had once made their lives among the granite peaks packed what they could carry and left the rest behind, sometimes literally. Furniture, tools, even entire buildings were simply abandoned because there was no economical way to move them out. By the mid-20th century, only a handful of stubborn residents remained, among them two siblings who ran the general store well into the 1950s and are remembered locally for essentially becoming the last human tether keeping St. Elmo from being erased from the map entirely. Today, dozens of its original wooden buildings still stand along the same dirt street, weathered gray by more than a century of Rocky Mountain winters, making it one of the best-preserved ghost towns in Colorado. Not far from St. Elmo, deeper into the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado, another chapter of this same story played out at a place called Animas Forks. Sitting at over 11,000 feet, near the headwaters of the Animas River, Animas Forks briefly served as a hub for the surrounding silver and gold mining district in the 1870s and 1880s. It even had a newspaper for a time, boldly named the Animas Forks Pioneer, an almost defiant statement of permanence in a place where the winter snowpack could bury single-story buildings up to their rooflines. Avalanches were a constant threat. Isolation was severe even for a mining town. Supplies had to be hauled in overpasses that could close without warning, stranding residents for weeks. When richer strikes were found elsewhere in the district and a smelter was built at a lower, more accessible town nearby, Animas Forks lost its reason for existing almost as quickly as it had gained one. By the early 1900s it was largely abandoned, and what remains today is a scattering of weathered structures, most famously a two-story house with distinctive bay windows that has become one of the most photographed ruins in the entire Colorado high country, sitting silently against a backdrop of some of the most dramatic alpine scenery in North America. What made these towns so fragile was not simply that the gold or silver eventually ran out. Nearly every mining district eventually faced that reality. It was the specific combination of remoteness, elevation, and economic dependency on a single resource that made their collapse so sudden and so complete. Unlike agricultural towns, which could often survive the decline of one industry by shifting to another, these mountain camps existed almost entirely because of what lay beneath the ground. When the ore body was exhausted, or when the price of silver collapsed, as it dramatically did in the early 1890s following a shift in federal monetary policy, there was frequently nothing left to hold a community together. Add to that brutal winters, the enormous cost and difficulty of hauling in every scrap of lumber, food, and machinery over mountain passes, and the constant threat of fire in towns built almost entirely of wood, and you begin to understand why so many of these places went from bustling boomtowns to empty shells within a single generation. Consider the story of Skidoo, tucked into the arid, sun-blasted mountains above Death Valley in California, a world away in climate from the snowbound camps of Colorado but subject to the same underlying pattern. Gold was discovered there in 1906, and the town that sprang up took its name from a popular slang phrase of the era, 23 Skidoo, reflecting the exact distance in miles that water had to be piped in from a spring to make the settlement livable at all, an engineering feat that was, in its own way, just as impressive as anything built in the high Rockies. At its peak, Skidoo held perhaps 500 residents, a stamp mill, a newspaper, and even a jail, and it became notorious across the region for a lynching that took place there in 1908, an event so widely reported that it added to the town's outlaw mystique. But the gold at Skidoo, rich as it initially appeared, proved shallow. By 1917, the mines were largely played out, the water pipeline was no longer worth maintaining, and the town was abandoned to the desert heat. Today almost nothing remains standing at the site, a reminder that some of these towns didn't even leave weathered buildings behind, the desert simply erased them, board by board, until only foundations and scattered debris remained to mark where a community once stood. Far to the north, in the mountains of Alaska, the pattern repeated itself once more, on an even more extreme scale. When gold was discovered along the Klondike River in the Yukon in 1896, and word finally reached the outside world in the summer of 1897, it triggered one of the most frantic mass migrations in North American history. Tens of thousands of hopeful prospectors, most with no mining experience at all, set out for the far north, hauling government-mandated tons of supplies over brutal mountain passes like the Chilkoot and White Pass, routes so steep and treacherous that they became etched into the era's photographic record as an almost mythic image of human determination and suffering. Towns like Dawson City in the Yukon and Dyea and Skagway on the Alaskan coast swelled overnight with populations in the tens of thousands, filled with saloons, gambling halls, opera houses, and hastily built hotels, all serving a population racing against the brief northern summer before the rivers froze and travel became nearly impossible. Dyea, in particular, is a striking example of just how completely a boomtown could vanish. At its height in 1898, it may have held as many as 8,000 people, a functioning port, and a town site laid out with the confidence of a permanent city. Yet once a competing route through Skagway won out and a railway was built along that alternate path instead, Dyea's usefulness ended almost instantly. Within a handful of years it was essentially empty, and today the Dyea River has reclaimed much of the original town site, leaving only a few pilings and building foundations half buried in the forest floor as evidence that a bustling gold rush port ever existed there at all. What is perhaps most remarkable about all of these places, from the sagebrush slopes above Bodie to the flooded riverbanks of Dyea, is how much of their daily life mirrored ordinary American towns of the era, even as they existed in circumstances that were anything but ordinary. Children still went to school in these camps, often in one-room buildings heated by wood stoves that had to be constantly fed against the mountain cold. Churches were built, sometimes competing denominations within a few blocks of one another. Fraternal organizations like the Masons and the Odd Fellows held meetings. Women ran boarding houses, taught in the schools, and in some towns operated their own businesses, even as the overall population of most mining camps skewed heavily male, particularly in the earliest boom years. Chinese immigrants, who had been central to the original California gold rush and to the subsequent construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, formed their own communities within many of these towns, often facing significant discrimination and, in some infamous cases, violent expulsion, even as their labor and enterprise helped sustain the local economy. Diaries and letters from residents of these towns describe a curious blend of hardship and genuine community, bitter cold, dangerous mining accidents, and outbreaks of disease sitting alongside dances, holiday celebrations, and the fierce, hopeful optimism that had drawn everyone there in the first place. That optimism is, in many ways, the emotional core of the entire gold rush era, and it is what makes these abandoned towns feel less like historical curiosities and more like monuments to a particular kind of human hope. Every person who rode a wagon or hiked a mountain pass toward one of these camps believed, at least in some part of themselves, that this would be the place where their fortunes changed forever. Most of them were wrong. Historians estimate that the overwhelming majority of gold rush prospectors never struck it rich, and that the people who profited most reliably were often not the miners themselves but the merchants, saloon keepers, and suppliers who sold them tools, food, and lodging at inflated boomtown prices. Yet the dream persisted, town after town, decade after decade, carrying people ever further into more remote and more dangerous terrain in search of the next great strike. By the early decades of the 20th century, the classic mountain gold rush had largely run its course. Advances in mining technology shifted the industry toward large-scale corporate operations capable of profitably processing lower grade ore in bulk, a model that favored established mining companies over independent prospectors and that often relocated operations to more accessible, lower elevation sites. The isolated, high-altitude boomtowns that had defined the previous half-century simply could not compete, and one by one they were left behind. Some, like Bodie and St. Elmo, have been preserved, protected either by state parks or by the sheer stubbornness of the terrain that limited later development. Others, like Skidoo and much of Dyea, have all but vanished, reclaimed by desert wind or northern forest, their locations known mainly to historians, hikers, and the occasional determined treasure hunter with a metal detector and a well-worn map. What remains, scattered across the high country of the American West and the far North, is a strange and haunting kind of archive, not written in books, but standing in wood and stone against some of the most spectacular mountain scenery on the continent. Walk down Bodie's main street today, and you can still see furniture through the windows of homes whose owners left in such haste, or with such little hope of returning, that they simply closed the door behind them. Stand in the ruins at Animas Forks, with the jagged peaks of the San Juans rising on every side, and it is not hard to imagine the sound of stamp mills once echoing off those same slopes, or to picture families gathered around a stove through a winter that could bury the building to its rooftop. These places endure not because the gold ever came back, but because the mountains themselves, indifferent to fortune and to failure alike, simply held on to what people left behind. In that silence, high above the tree line, the lost towns of the gold rush remain exactly as they were the day the last resident walked away, testaments not to riches found, but to the sheer scale of hope it took to go looking for them in such unforgiving, breathtaking, and ultimately unyielding country.